I am a pre-doctoral fellow with the Smithsonian from Stony Brook University in New York. And I'm here for the 6-month period looking at the interaction between a boring sponge, Thionivarians, and the coral Porites porites, and how that interaction changes whenever you include different temperatures and pHs. So I'm looking at the interaction between ocean acidification and climate change using an experimental setup that you see here. Each of these blue barrels is where the treatment occurs. So you'll see that some of them are labeled high CO2 and heat, others are labeled ambient. They're all randomized. The CO2 is added within the barrels as well as the heat, and then it's fed into these smaller tanks where we have sponges and corals, or just corals alone. So I'm interested in the interaction between the coral and the sponge species because in a healthy natural ecosystem, they're sort of equal in competition. So the natural role of the sponge is so that whenever you have dead or diseased coral, the boring sponge comes in and it helps to break down that old dead coral structure. So it's recycling and restructuring the reef. And this is really part of an essential healthy ecosystem. However, the problem comes in that once humans have started altering coral reef ecosystems, particularly with things like climate change and ocean acidification, which are both directly caused by an excess of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. As you may or may not know, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases the ability of the Earth to keep heat in. And so the climate is slowly getting warmer, particularly the ocean temperatures. And as we increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's infiltrating into the seawater itself, and it's actually causing the seawater to become slightly more acidic by dropping the pH just by 0.1 to 0.4 units. And this is a really big problem for things that calcify, particularly corals. There have been a lot of studies done. Corals can't grow the way that they do in a normal natural seawater state whenever you have the pH being lowered. So the two things sort of compound. So the corals are threatened by ocean acidification and climate change, and this increases their stress level and incidence of disease, while at the same time the boring sponges are taking advantage of these weaker coral structures and starting the breakdown process much faster and much more efficient than would have normally been possible in a healthy ecosystem. So to replicate future climate change and ocean acidification scenario, I'm using 3 different levels of CO2 being added to the seawater. The first level is not actually adding any CO2 at all, so it's what today's seawater is experiencing. And then I'm adding a medium level of CO2, which is meant to replicate the projected level of CO2 in the atmosphere in the year 2050. And then my highest level of CO2 is meant to replicate the year 2100. So there are 3 levels of CO2 being added to replicate the ocean acidification. And then to increase the temperature that these corals and sponges are experiencing, I'm adding heaters to certain tanks and increasing the seawater temperature by 1 degree Celsius. And that may seem like a small amount, but because we're as close to the equator as we are here in Bocas del Toro, the projected temperature increase is roughly between 1 and 2 degrees Celsius. Temperatures here are already pretty constant year-round and already pretty high, so any further increase is just enough to stress them out, which is what we're trying to replicate for the future. So for a total of 3 different pH treatments, or CO2 treatments, and 2 temperature, 1 with increase and 1 with decrease, or rather not decrease, just the same. And then I will either have corals without any sponges at all, or corals with sponges attached to them. And naturally in the wild, these sponges will attach to the coral, preferably if the coral is dead. However, these particular boring sponges have zooxanthellae, And so they require high amounts of light. So they are a direct competitor with the coral and will attach to living coral if they need to compete for light in that area. So my attachment of them directly replicates what's happening in the ecosystem naturally. So overall, the study is very important for us to understand how these changes and shifts in species interactions are going to play out in the future. Particularly if we want to try and conserve what we have now, we need to understand the mechanisms that are going into what may be happening in the future. So the study that I'm doing will hopefully inform us of how one particular species interaction between Clyonivarians and Porites porites will change in the future. Thanks so much. My name is Stubler. I am a doctoral candidate at Stony Brook University in New York. I'm also a pre-doctoral fellow for the Smithsonian, and I'm here doing a project looking at the interactions between ocean acidification and temperature change on, I don't know what I'm doing actually.